So let us now look at the rifle companies and their grisly fate in detail. Contrary to some historians' assertion that Colonel Pullein commanded the battle from some remote point near Isandlwana, not one of the numerous survivors who'd been in the camp itself or fled through it before the Zulus closed right in, none of them saw Pullein there. No doubt he was commanding his men from the front. He also sent his adjutant, Captain Melville, to fetch the colours, possibly as a rallying point for the battalion, possibly as the film Zulu Dawn shows, to try and get them to safety. The southernmost company was Captain Pope's G Company. You can see there. That was the only company from the 2nd Battalion which had been left behind when Lord Chelmsford went off on his expedition. And apart from the ever-increasing numbers of Zulus to his front, Captain Pope there would have seen Colonel Durnford's withdrawal to his south and the subsequent swarm of thousands of Zulus coming along his southern flank, and he would have been horrified. He probably realized that he would soon be cut off, and he now formed square. And so his company was the first to be destroyed, the men falling where they fought in square. And so they're now gone. Now, we know this because when their comrades, all the other companies of the 2nd Battalion, found them after the battle, their bodies, G Company's bodies, were all found all together, more or less in a square, in the position where the company had been posted when the rest of the battalion marched off with Lord Chelmsford. Well, the next company to the north of G Company was Captain Wardell's H Company. Wardell fell back in bounds using a tactic with a section of 20 men under Colour Sergeant Wolfe to form a rear guard to fire and allow the main body to break clean. And this would have been repeated once or twice. But sadly, in due course, Wolfe and his men were overrun and killed, and their bodies were found all together. The remainder of the company managed to fall back to the vicinity of the camp. By now, most of the native levies had fled, including much of Durnsford's force, because, of course, they had horses. The southern part of the camp was now defended by one of the 2 quartermasters, and his name was Pullen, not to be confused with Colonel Pullein. Well, the quartermaster Pullen had an assorted bunch of men, and he was joined by Colonel Durnford and the few of his men who had not fled or been killed. By now, large numbers of men were fleeing if they could. None of the rifle companies, but mostly native levies, wagon drivers, and some of the auxiliaries in the camp fled. Now, flight is not cowardice if defeat is clear and inevitable. But for many of Durnsford's men, that flight was cowardice. And some of those fleeing, in fact, many of them, made off on the road to Rorke's Drift, only to find that the road was closed by the Zulus. That's heading west. Most of those trying to flee headed south towards a crossing the river known as Fugitives Drift, and they were pursued by Zulus, and the Zulus killed almost all who were of the fugitives who were not mounted on horseback. And now we come to the last stands of the remaining companies of the 24th Regiment. Well, this slide probably shows the best estimate of how things went. Note that C, F, E and A companies at their final rallying point a firing line. It's the black line up at the northern end of the camp. And here you can see the companies, and you can see now how the companies fell back through the camp and reached the places that they were finally overrun. The situation of the rifle companies now was that G Company was already destroyed, as I've mentioned. The other companies were steadily falling back into the camp and through the camp, possibly 50% or 75% strong, perhaps 340 of them in total. As they reached the camp, they would have been able to scrounge more ammunition, but probably not in vast quantities. The next company to be destroyed was Captain de Geyscher's A Company, which formed square, where you can see there, and they fought until they were overrun. 50 of their bodies were later found exactly there. Well, fighting was now going on amongst the tents, and fascinatingly, we have Zulu evidence of an individual act of courage. Now, the only member of the Royal Navy to die in the Zulu War was signalman William Ainslie. He was the manservant, or the Batman, if you like, of Lieutenant Milne, Royal Navy, who had accompanied Chelmsford. Lieutenant Milne had accompanied Chelmsford. And remember, he was the chap with the telescope that Chelmsford had sent to the top of the hill. Well, he'd left his servant Ainslie behind in order to pack up his kit, ready to follow on when all the men at Isandlwana followed Lord Chelmsford. Well, Ainslie took his naval cutlass and he fought off the Zulus for a long time with his back to a wagon wheel. He inflicted many casualties on his attackers, and the Zulus later described how the only way to kill him was that one of their numbers crept up behind and stabbed him in the back through the wheel spokes. Meanwhile, Captain Wardell's H Company had formed square. That's off to the right of that diagram. And there they fought ferociously, and then they fell back to link up with Durnford's group and formed square again with around 100 men. They would have been running low on ammunition and surrounded by huge numbers of Zulus whose throwing assegais and primitive guns would nevertheless have been deadly at short range. Zulus commented later that this group held them off for a long time, although that long time might have been no more than 5 or 10 minutes. The Zulus were unstoppable and they annihilated the group, and there is the monument for Wardell's last stand and where the bodies of his men were found. The Zulus later made a song dedicated, they said, to the fight with the zebras. And that was the name that they give to the Carbineers who were part of Durnford's mounted force, because the Carbineers wore white striped trousers, so looked like zebras. Well, this leaves C, F, and E companies in the area of the camp. The ammunition wagons had been overrun by the Zulus, and so these men too would have been running out of ammunition. They would have realized that the situation was hopeless. Lieutenant Anstey of F Company led a group of men, and there's Anstey. He led a group of about 60 men in a forlorn bid to reach Fugitives Drift, which is down there, bottom left of the picture. He was pursued by several hundred Zulus. Every now and then, his men would turn and fire and then run on until their ammunition was gone and they had to use their bayonets. And so they died in groups along the trail. The trail goes from where the cameraman is standing off into the distance there, and you can see the group of cairns where a stand is made and the soldiers are killed. Anstey, interestingly, his body was the only one recovered to the United Kingdom after the battle, and he is buried in Woking. Well, the remaining men of C, F, and E companies now fought on desperately in makeshift squares. They were showered with assegais, and the Zulus, in many cases, held up their own dead in front of them to drag down the bayonets of the defenders and expose them to attack. Steadily, over a period of minutes, the redcoat numbers in the squares dwindled from 60 to 40 to 30 to 20 and then to none. The savagery of this last struggle, the terror for the soldiers, and yet their determined, desperate resistance in the face of utterly overwhelming odds and the certainty of horrible death is quite impossible to describe adequately. I can only offer this statement made after the battle by a Zulu who was there. And he says, and I quote, "It took a long time to drive back the English forces. They killed us and we killed them, and the fight was kept up for a long time. The British troops became helpless because they had no ammunition and the Zulus killed them. Some Zulus threw assegais at them, others shot at them, but we didn't dare get close. We avoided the bayonet, for any man who went up to stab a soldier was fixed through the throat or the stomach and at once fell. Occasionally, when a soldier was engaged with a Zulu in front, another Zulu killed him from behind." Well, the last group to die was that of Captain Younghusband and the remains of C Company. These men had scrambled up onto a rocky shelf halfway up Isandlwana's southeast slope. By now, they were almost certainly out of ammunition, and they held off the Zulus for a while until more and more Zulus climbed up onto higher ground behind them, shooting at them and throwing spears. With their numbers dwindling, and in a final act of courage and despair, Younghusband led a desperate bayonet charge downhill and into the Zulu horde. Perhaps the charge got 30 yards before its inevitable annihilation. Well, almost every British soldier or auxiliary at Isandlwana was now dead, and the Zulus set about looting the camp and disemboweling the British corpses. You see, they did that because it was their tradition to do this in order to release the souls of the dead. They also had a habit of taking and wearing the jackets of those that they'd killed. One soldier continued to fire from a small cave high up on Isandlwana, and given the general noise of looting and the discharge of firearms, it was a while before the Zulus realized that they were being sniped at and the occasional Zulu was dropping dead. Well, when they realized that, a party of Zulus climbed up and shot the soldier. Now, we know this happened because there was a lone black wagon driver who didn't take part in the battle, but managed to hide very close to the summit, and he could see what was going on in the camp. He tells that he saw at one stage a tall white man suddenly emerge from a tent and open fire on the Zulus to such an effect that the Zulus fell back, and anybody approaching the man was bayoneted. A crowd of Zulus now stopped looting in order to watch this little battle, which, of course, ended inevitably with the lone white man being shot. Here's a photograph taken of the remaining wagons not long after the battle. Well, the bodies of some 360 out of 600 white soldiers now lay in clearly identifiable locations where stands had been made. At about 6 o'clock in the evening, most of Chelmsford's force had returned, and although witnesses had seen the great majority of the Zulus withdrawing over the hills, taking with them some 40 wagons loaded with their dead and wounded, there was now a careful advance by Chelmsford's force in the vicinity of the camp. The force spent the night under arms, ready for anything. The native contingents with them barely suppressed their terror, and in the distance there were the ominous flames and the sound of shooting from the direction of Rorke's Drift. But of course, Rorke's Drift is another story. So, could the disaster have been avoided? Well, by employing that wonderful sense, hindsight, the outcome might have been very different by doing some or all of the following. By not underestimating the Zulus from the outset, by sending scouting parties and pickets much farther out, by not sending the 2nd Battalion of the 24th Regiment to reinforce Major Dartnell, by leaguering up the wagons and thus making a more strongly defended camp, by keeping the rifle companies close to the camp in the early stages, and if you had kept everybody close and in a square with the wagons as well, you would have been able to have every ammunition box open and close to the men, and lack of ammunition would not have been a problem. Well, had all these measures been adopted, I feel sure that the British would not have been overwhelmed and the Zulu casualties would have been horrendous, leading to an inevitable Zulu withdrawal. This in turn would have allowed a British pursuit by mounted troops and a massacre of the Zulus rather than the British. But as I said, this is with the benefit of hindsight, and it's probably more useful to examine the actions and decisions in light of the known facts at the time. And my observations of this are as follows. The Boers had given the British authorities ample warnings of Zulu military prowess, and thus there was no excuse for underestimating the Zulus. Whilst Chelmsford's splitting of his force was probably fatal, given the fact that he had no way of knowing that a gigantic Zulu force was making for Isandlwana, I find it difficult to be overcritical of him there. Pauline's deploying of his rifle companies out a mile or two from the camp turned out to be fatal in that had they been held round the camp, a solid, coherent defence with uninterrupted ammunition supply might well have defeated the Zulus, but given Pauline's lack of intelligence regarding the location and size of the Zulu armies, that means that his decisions were actually quite reasonable and logical given what we knew at the time. And there really to end up with are the casualty figures for the entire action. As you can see there, 25,000 Zulus probably there, and a couple of thousand of them killed. And there are the British casualties at the top. Quite staggering, really, and similar in many ways to what happened to Custer a few years before, although in larger numbers. And there we are. So I've come to the end of the talk, and if anybody has any questions, I will do my best to answer them.
James, I think you've overwhelmed people with the information and there are no questions. We're also actually got a time pressure. So thank you very much.
Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed it, and I wish you all a good night.
Thank you very much. Cheers.